Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's virtual tour brought to you by Region 9, KFDX, and the Arts Council Wichita Falls Area, Inc. Well, winter is coming, and with that comes wonderfully cold days when you just want to throw a blanket over you and read a good book. But if you're lucky, the blanket you'll choose will be a quilt with amazing designs, all created from geometric shapes. Who figures out all these wonderful pictures that can be put onto these quilts and using, different squares, circles, rectangles, and many different other shapes? It's like a giant game of Tetris for figures to come out and make them all fit together to create the image that you want. Now, how exactly do people make these triangles, match them up into squares, and put them all together? Like, how does that work?
Well, your imagination is your only limit. You can do whatever you want with quilts. That's the beauty of it. I've got some examples here. You start with squares, and then you can cut them into triangles. And with the triangles, are these showing? I don't think they're showing.
Well,
there we are. Let's go back.
Introduce you. This is our wonderful guest today, Miss Audrey B., President of the Red River Quilters Guild. Welcome, Miss B. Before we begin, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been sewing for over 50 years. I graduated with a degree in home ec, which they don't do anymore, but with the emphasis in sewing. I started quilting about 25 years ago, and then about 12 years ago I started teaching quilting.
That's pretty amazing, yeah. There's so much about quilting that I'd love to know more about. Now, can you tell me a little bit about the Red Rivers Quilters Guild and how you can become more involved with that?
Well, the Red River Quilters Guild was started in 1984 with a few quilters that got together to share the passion. And from there it's grown. Now we have over 75 members. We have a quilt show every year, which I think you saw pictures of that a little bit earlier. And we meet once a month. We get together, we talk about quilting, and we do show and tell where we show each other's quilts and get ideas and talk about quilting.
I hope we can do a little bit of show and tell coming up here in a little bit. I know you brought a bunch of wonderful examples. Now, I know we all know what a quilt is, but I don't know that we all understand how a quilt is made. Can you share with us some general steps that are used in making a quilt?
Sure. Well, the quilt's made of three parts. The first is the piecework, the top part, and that's what you see when you look at a quilt. Then there's the batting that goes in the middle, and then the backing. The top part is called the piecework, and the actual sewing the three layers together is the actual quilting of it. But the quilt as a whole is just called the quilting.
That's pretty cool. I didn't know there were three different layers.
Three layers. You got to have something in the middle, and then the binding goes on the outside to hold them all together.
And the top part has the wonderful designs and everything on them, correct?
Correct. Uh-huh.
All right. Now, is it true that there's many different styles of quilts?
Oh yeah. There's a lot of styles. The traditional is the one I favor, and that's what the samples that I brought. But they get into art quilts where you look at the quilt and it looks like a photograph, and those are just amazing to me how they put those together. Then there's applique where you sew on top of the quilt, and I brought a sample of that. Just all kinds of quilting. Modern quilting now has come into play. That's using more of the vibrant colors and the bigger blocks.
I gotta say, I do like the vibrant colors myself. A couple of the ones that I was looking at your stack there have some pretty bright colors, and they sort of interest me. Definitely like the green colors. I don't know, maybe it's because of the green screen I stand in front of, but do like the green quilts that you have in your stack there. Now, one of the ladies at the past weekend's quilt show was hand quilting. What all does that entail? What does that look like to quilt by hand?
Hand quilting was kind of what they did in the olden days. The women would sit around in a big circle, and they'd put the quilt on a frame, and they would use a needle and thread to put the three layers together. Whereas today, most of us use a machine to put the top together, where it's the regular sewing machine or the long arm that you'll see a little bit later. I'd like to show you some of these blocks and how they go together, going back to the pieces of a quilt and the parts of a quilt.
That'd be really cool. We got a whole bunch of parts here.
Samples here. So if you start with the two blocks, where do I show the two blocks? If you start with the two blocks, then you can cut them into two pieces, so now you've got two triangles. So you need to know what triangles are. when you sew them together, you actually have what's called a half square triangle. And it's called that because it's square, but it's half of it square and it's in a triangle. And then you can see the back of it where we sew the stitches together. And then you can take this one and make it smaller. If you have 4 small triangles, you can put them together in what we call a quarter square triangle. Quarter square because there's 4 parts. A lot of the quilts use rectangles and squares and half squares and all kinds of math stuff.
Yeah, definitely a lot of math will go into this. How do you, what type of math is involved with building or quilting a quilt?
Well, if I want to make this quilt, then I cut my fabric 2.5 inches wide. If I want to make this quilt bigger and I want to make the block bigger, then I would cut this block 4 inches wide, 4.5 inches. I'd have to figure out what size quilt I want to figure out what size block I'm going to make, and then to figure out how many blocks across, because this is a block and that's a block, so you count how many blocks across you want to make. And then you have to figure out how much fabric to buy to make the quilt that you've just designed.
So you have measuring, you have math with money involved, different sizes of things, fractions. I know those are sometimes a little tricky to be able to use fractions.
When you're cutting the fabric for the triangles, you want to cut your size and 7/8 inch. 7/8 inch. And a lot of people have trouble, a lot of adults have trouble. I've taught 75 women and 3 men how to quilt in Wichita Falls. And I know a lot of them don't know math. That 7/8 inch is a killer for them. So learn your eighths while you're in school. It makes it easier when you're an adult.
I know we're talking a lot about math. Do any of the students have any questions about quilting or about the math involved with quilting?
I see a hand.
I see some hands.
Okay, go ahead. Okay.
How many pieces do you have to use to make a big one?
Speak up.
How many pieces do you have to use to make a big one?
Can you hear her?
How many pieces do you have to use to make a big quilt?
It depends. Is that the question? How many pieces to make a big quilt? And that depends on the pattern you're making. If you're making this size, you would need big pieces and little pieces. If you're making one that looks more like this, you're using a whole lot of little pieces. That one uses big pieces. So it just depends on what size you want to make. My sister made a quilt recently that had over 1,000 little pieces in it.
Wow, that's quite a lot.
That's quite a lot.
Was it one of the special
It
design
was
ones?
the Bargello. It was a fancy one.
Are there any other questions?
Good question.
How do you stitch the quilt?
I stitch the quilts with a sewing machine. There are some ladies that stitch by hand like they did in the olden days. They use a needle and thread. But I use a sewing machine, and I do everything with the sewing machine. We use a 1/4 inch seam. In regular sewing on garments, you sew a 5/8 inch seam, but on quilting, you use a 1/4 inch seam. Again, the fractions.
So we can take one more question.
Are you supposed to lay with a quilt on your bed?
You can. There's a lot of uses for quilts. A bed quilt is very popular. I have one on my bed. All my kids have quilts. You can also use them for a lap quilt when you're watching television to kind of snuggle up and watch TV. I've also made a quilt for my cat to lay on. She's got a little quilt on the floor that she likes to lay on. So a quilt can be whatever you want to use it for. They're good to go on a picnic. But they're also heirloom quilts, like you make real fancy ones that you want to keep and save. So those you wouldn't want to put on the ground. So it just depends on what you want to do with it.
All right, now I know you were talking about hand quilting earlier. Let's take a look at what that entails.
Okay. Let's see. Those are some quilt bags that we had at the retreat at the quilt show that were available for sale. Those were made with fabric samples. But I don't see the hand quilting coming up. It'll be here shortly. But with the hand quilting, they get a big loop, big hoop, and they draw the needle. They draw a pattern out on top of the quilt that they want to follow, and then they use the needle and thread to follow that pattern. Let's see if I can find one you can see the pattern.
There are some very well-designed quilts on that wall there. Some pretty neat things, neat designs.
Let me see if I, this one maybe you can see the design on the back. Up there's Mary. Whoop, Mary went away. But this one you can see, can you see how the design is where they did the quilting? It comes around in circles. That's the design that the hand quilter would follow. It's not always a straight line.
Those are some pretty neat designs. Looked like there were some letters on the design of the back of that one.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So you can do a bunch of
just
different
got
things.
letters.
It doesn't have to be a straight line.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And you
Lots of things.
don't just have to quilt by hand either, right? Because not everyone does that.
Not everyone does that. That's kind of a dying art. Very few people do that anymore. And I don't. I'm impressed with the people that do. But I do all mine on a sewing machine. Either I do the top on the regular sewing machine, and then when I put the three together, I do it on a long arm. And we'll get to a long arm shortly.
Yeah, some
I'll
folks,
show you what that is.
They quilt their pieces. Well, when the quilts are so long, the machine actually is the one that's moving instead of the fabric. Let's take a look at how that works.
Right. Your regular sewing machine is stationary and you move your fabric. With the long arm, the fabric is stationary and you move the machine. Is
Do we
it
have
coming
the
up?
footage
Let's see
of
if
the
it's
long arm
coming up.
machine?
There
we
it
go.
is. This particular long arm is a 12-foot frame, and the quilt goes on the frame, and then you move the machine to go across the quilt, and that puts the design in the quilt that holds the three layers together.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting machine moving back and forth.
That one is computerized. Some of them are not. Some of them you have to do manually. Some of them, that one is computerized. I plug in the design that I want. And again, math, I have to figure out how many passes of the machine to get through this whole quilt and how wide each pass should be so that it'll come out even at the bottom, at the end of the quilt. And how wide is the quilt, so I want to make sure that my pattern fits in and I'm not going off.
That's pretty interesting.
It is.
Now, you were also telling me that you are a teacher as well, correct?
Yes.
Now, we were introduced to one of your students, Mary
Mary McIlvain.
McIlvain, and she shared a little bit about her quilting journey. Let's take a look.
So I made this one for my husband, who's a pilot. It has all aviation fabric. It is a traditional log cabin block. So it starts here. This is the heart of the home. And then you sew increasingly larger rectangles to that until you get this block. And then you piece your blocks together in rows, and then you sew those rows together into the top. Add your borders, and you're ready to start quilting. When it comes to making a quilt, you always have to make allowances for your seams. So traditionally, you will make a quilt with 1/4 inch seams. And so when you're trying to calculate how large a piece of fabric you'll need to cut, you have to allow for 1/4 inch on either side of that, all sides of that, so that it will come to the size that you need it to be to fit with the rest of your pattern. So there is quite a bit of math involved in quilting, but you don't realize you're doing math. It's a fun way to do math. And so I had to be able to add, to calculate the navy border and then say how much of each of these other fabrics do I need. And also the same thing with my binding, because it's different fabrics as well. So I had to be able to calculate the circumference of a rectangle in order to know exactly how much binding I need, because that would be a shame to get to the binding stage and go, rats, I ran out of fabric, so you got to be able to do your math so you know that you have the right amount. My grandmother was an avid hand quilter, so she sewed pieces together by hand, and when she had a large enough quilt, she quilted them together by hand. She did not drive, so her one-car garage was a hanging quilt frame, and she died when I was 6, so before that, I would be under the quilt. She would pass the needle down and put her finger where she wanted it to come back up, and I was under the quilt passing it back up through to her. So it has been a wonderful heritage for me personally, learning to quilt from her and then taking it the next level, using a machine to quilt for me, and celebrating the art.
Wow, some of those quilts look really cool. That spiral quilt, that's definitely a little unique, right?
That's more of the modern quilt.
All right. Now, you've been teaching for quite a while. How long have you been teaching?
I've been teaching quilting for 12 years. I moved here from California where I had a lot of opportunity for classes, and out here there wasn't much opportunity. My friends wanted to learn how to quilt, so I became a quilt teacher. Mary, I taught to quilt about 3 years ago, and she does phenomenal work.
So in 3 years, she learned to quilt that well. Is it common to learn how to quilt that fast, and how hard is it to learn?
Oh, I can teach you how to quilt in a day.
Really?
A basic quilt, and then you add on to that, and it gets more complex. The more complex you want, you can go that way.
How complex can it get?
Oh, I made one quilt that took me about 4 months to put together, but some quilts I can put together in like 3 days. That block that Mary was showing you, that's called a log cabin block, and that one, it starts with one block in the middle, and it adds blocks all the way around. This pattern was generated back in the Civil War days when they had the Underground Railroad. A quilt made with this quilt would tell the runaway slaves that this is a safe path to go to, and this is a safe house for them. So a lot of the blocks have good history to them.
A lot of historical significance to some of these quilts. That's
Yes.
pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Right. Now, the Quilters Guild will make quilts to be given away, correct?
We do. We make a lot of quilts. We give quilts to Patsy's House for Children's Advocacy, the Red Cross. When somebody's house burns down and they don't have anything left, we give them a quilt, and it's comfort. Some people think they're charity quilts, but they're not. It's a comfort. We like to give comfort, and we think that's what our quilts give. We give them to a number of organizations, and one of our favorite is the Quilts of Valor, where we give them to our veterans, our men and women that have served in the military to protect our country. We give them a Quilt of Valor in appreciation for what they've done. Those are some Quilts of Valor that are shown on the screen right now. These will be given to veterans in November. We'll have a big ceremony.
Quilts. They look amazing.
That's one of mine.
Really cool.
Thank you.
How with those designs, are they sort of fractal out like that? Do you just start in the center and work your way out, or?
They're just blocks. You make the blocks, and it's how you arrange the blocks. This particular block you can make 12 different quilts out of, just by the way you lay it out.
Really? So many different options with quilts as well. Mm-hmm. It's a great way to express your creativity, right?
It is. It really is. It really is. And that's it. Quilting's my passion. And a lot of people, when I teach them to quilt, it becomes their passion because it's relaxing, it's enjoyable, and you have something to show for it. Plus, it makes great gifts. So you have a friend you want to make something for, you give them a quilt, they keep it forever.
That's really cool. A gift that can last for so long.
They do.
Does anyone have any questions about the different styles of quilts or the different machines used to make these quilts?
Okay, go ahead. Speak loud. Go for it.
If you write your name on a quilt, if you like order a quilt and like have your name on it.
I couldn't hear that.
Could you have?
He wants to know if he could write his name on a quilt. Could you put your name on a quilt? As far as
Can
I've
you put your
made.
name on your quilt?
Yes.
Yes. We have some quilts. When a lady makes a quilt for a baby's shower, they can put the baby's name on the quilt with the date and the time that the baby was born. Or if you I'm making a quilt right now for a lady whose daughter just turned 40, and she wants happy 40th birthday on it. So I'm going to be putting that on there. So you can put anything you want on your quilt.
What, Madeline?
Are all your quilts stitched homemade?
Hers.
Are my quilts homemade? I make all of my quilts at home. Yes, you can go to Walmart and buy a quilt, but it's a kind of a cheap, flimsy quilt that won't last. The quilts that we make, we use a better quality fabric and a closer stitch and a prettier pattern, and they do last a long time. But we do make our quilts at home.
So making things homemade,
They're all
definitely the way to
homemade.
go.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Have you
Was there another?
any quilts with like video game designs on it?
He wants to know if you've made it.
Quilt myself
Quilts with
too.
video games? Well, did I bring it? It's not a video game. I have a quilt with Olaf, and I didn't bring it. I have a quilt with Captain America. It's just whatever you can find pattern, you can make the quilt with that fabric. You just need to find fabric that has that pattern on it.
So you can probably make one with like Mario, Sonic, all the classic game characters.
Oh, yeah. And quilts are really fun to wrap up in when you're playing your video games.
That's true, especially winter come the way. Definitely want to wrap up.
That's it. Can we,
One more question? Or,
How long does it take to make a quilt?
How long does it take to make a quilt? That depends on how big the quilt is and how complex the pattern is. I've made one in 1 day before I put out a quilt, and another quilt took me 4 months to make. It just depends on, this one is kind of small, and I can do that real fast. I could do this one in a day. This one's called the miniature, and you can hang it on the wall. It's not really one you'd put on the bed. It's not big enough. But you could make this one to go on the bed if you made the stripes bigger and if you added more. This one's called a rail fence, and you can see how it kind of zigzags down across the quilt.
All right.
now with this one here, it looks like there's a lot of geometric shapes, a lot of math involved with it.
These,
So yeah, definitely, clearly, a lot of math happens when you make a quilt. Would you say that it's good to be good at math when making a quilt, or does quilting help you develop your skills in math?
both. If you know math ahead of time, then it makes your quilting easier. If you don't know math when you're quilting, you will figure it out.
So it's a great learning tool. It's a great artistic tool,
Right.
expression. There's so much can go into a quilt.
So much. These are made with little rectangles. The other ones I showed are made of squares or diamonds and triangles.
All right.
So
Now, we've been talking about these quilts. Now, if someone wanted one of them, how much would it cost to get one from the Quilters Guild and compare that to like Walmart or Target?
well, fabric right now is running about $12 a yard. So if you wanted a quilt that was about 65 inches by 65 inches, that'd be a big throw. It wouldn't quite fit your bed, but you're going to have 6 yards of fabric in that and 5 yards for the backing. So $11 a yard, it adds up. Then you need 2 yards of batting and another 5/8 yard for the binding. And then the labor to make it is going to take about 50 hours to put together a standard quilt. And then assembling it to put the quilting together is another couple hours. And then the quilting's about 5 hours if you do it on the long arm, a lot longer if you do it by hand. So the total cost of a quilt could be about $600 or $700, $800. And you can go to Walmart and buy one for $35. Which one do you think is going to last longer?
I think the one made by hand is probably going to last a little bit longer.
You're right. You're right.
I'm pretty sure you guys make it with love, too. Get
Oh, yeah.
some
I
emotion
love
in
in
there.
every stitch. Yeah. I'd like to show some of these blocks. This quilt is made just by putting big blocks together. It's
It's a simple design, but I really like it. I
simple
like the
design,
animals
but it
with this
comes
one.
out cute. This one has
Pull it
zoo
up.
animals all over it.
Yeah. Can we get it on the other one? A closer look? Zoo animals?
And then
Zoo
if you
animals and
take
stuff.
that and every other block, this is called a 4-patch. In every other block, you put a little 4-patch in it. It's the same quilt pattern, but it's just using different blocks. Then if you take that 4-patch and add it with other blocks and squares, you can come up with this pattern. And that looks similar to this one, but again, the blocks and the arrangement are different. So it's your imagination, your creativity, whatever you want to do.
So you can take the same sort of pattern, but the way you lay it out can make an entirely different quilt, even though there's some similarities, but definitely quite different.
Same fabric, different pattern, looks different.
So cool.
This one goes back to the second one I showed. This one's the 4-patch. And this is called a 4-patch. Can you tell me why? 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 little squares in that block, and that's what makes it a 4-patch. We also have a block that we call a 9-patch, and that's where you take 9 squares and put them together. Most quilts are built around the 4-patch or the 9-patch setup.
What would you say is probably the most complicated type of quilt to make? If you wanted to challenge yourself, which one would you go for?
The double wedding ring.
The double. Okay, that sounds complicated.
It is.
What all does that
I
entail?
haven't made one. It's still on my challenge list. It's one that a lot of people make to give as a wedding present to people, and it's double circles that interlock, and they're little tiny pieces that go in a circle. It's very, very pretty. But what's challenging is something new, something different, taking fabric and picturing in your head what would look good, what pattern would this fabric look good in, or taking a pattern and saying what fabric would I like for that.
Now, for people starting off, building the idea in their head, should they think more like in terms of squares, or does it matter how they start thinking about building the quilt?
I don't think it matters. You can take graph paper and draw it out, and whatever you draw out, you can make with fabric. The log cabin that Mary did looks very complicated, but that's actually a beginner quilt. A lot of people make that for their very first quilt.
It looked very beautiful. So.
It's a beautiful pattern.
All right. Now, for the students watching, if they wanted to learn more about quilting, where should they begin their search?
Online, you can find a lot on what little videos called YouTube. A lot of it on YouTube. Or you can go to the Guild website and find a lot of information through the Guild website, which is wichitafallsquiltguild.org. A lot of information there. There are classes that you can take. Some quilt shops offer classes. YouTube's the most popular right now.
And for the students watching, do y'all have any questions about building quilts or how to get into quilt making?
Well,
Have y'all seen mine? Because I have a quilt in there.
this little girl out here has a quilt at the quilts show. So, was it from your grandmother?
No, it was from my aunt.
But her aunt made one. Her aunt.
By one of the students' aunts.
Oh, that's pretty cool that her aunt made one of the quilts.
This one, yes.
Oh, yeah?
Uh-huh.
That's pretty cool.
Have any of y'all thought about making a quilt yourselves?
Do you want to make a quilt? We did one for a project in here, and so.
Does anyone in your family already quilt?
Yeah, how many?
Your grandma quilt or mom quilt?
He has made a quilt. I made for him a quilt.
Yeah.
My grandma made a whole entire quilt.
Yes, several of them have said that they've seen their grandparents and have quilts. So.
That's.
My grandma makes some.
I'm a grandma, so I can relate. Grandmas make quilts. Yes, we
I
do.
wish I had a quilt when I was growing up. My family didn't have very many quilts. We had blankets, but we didn't really get many quilts.
And there's a big difference.
Definitely is. You had to really pile on the blankets in order to stay warm, especially during the winter. But
Yeah.
I'm guessing, like these quilts, they feel pretty substantial. I bet they keep you pretty warm, too.
They do. And if once in a while you throw a second one on just like a blanket. But it's the design that we enjoy.
It's the artistry,
Artistry.
staying warm, the art behind it. So many wonderful things. Now we're almost out of time. What would you tell the students about pursuing art in their lives and the benefits of understanding math while working with the art?
The thing I enjoy about quilting is it's relaxing to me. If I've had a stressful day, I can go sit at my sewing machine, block out everything else, and just enjoy the process of making something. And when I'm finished, I have something. You know, if I clean my house, it gets dirty again. But if I make a quilt, I have a quilt to keep or a quilt to give away. And that's part of the enjoyment of it. And then when you give a quilt, the person that's receiving it is so appreciative most often because they understand the trouble and the work and the cost that goes into it. It is a prized possession.
And you can make them very unique to the individual
Make them
you're giving
unique,
it to.
yes. And you can make them for yourself, too. I have quite a few that I made for myself.
I think if I was making one, I'd probably do the video game route. I don't know, just like that.
You got to keep the first one, though. First one you make, you got to keep. Then you can give them away.
All right, well, thank you, Miss Audrey B., for sharing with us how you learned about quilting and the fun different ways that people can think about quilts and the math that's involved with them. I wanted to thank you again for joining us on this virtual tour, with a special thanks to KFDX for making this possible. Please join us again next month as we show how math helps in the art of flying a plane, as we continue investigating how art and math tie together in the world around us. On behalf of Region 9, and
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for watching.
thanks for coming.
Bye.